The following video you're about to watch is my sermon at Bridgewater Evangelical Church, which is a brand new church plant here in Adelaide, South Australia. I've been preaching through the book of Matthew, and I'm currently preaching at Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through to 23. So I hope you enjoy this video. If you're interested in coming along to Bridgewater Evangelical Church, we meet at the Bridgewater Hall. You can visit our website, bridgewaterevangelicalchurch.com.au, and you can get the address there at the bottom of the screen. But we meet there at 10:30 every single Sunday. Well, I hope to see you if you're from Adelaide. Otherwise, enjoy the sermon. Matthew chapter 2 is normally talked about during Christmas because it's all about Jesus and the wise men coming to Jesus and so forth. But because we're going verse by verse, or book by book, verse by verse through the Bible, we're going to go through chapter 2. So let's just get right into it. Let's begin with verse 1. It says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem." Now Bethlehem means house of bread, and it was the town where Jacob buried his wife Rachel, and it was the place where Ruth and Boaz met and lived, and it was the place where King David was born and raised. So it's a significant town, but it's a very small town. It probably had about 300 people living in it at the time of Christ. So it's quite a small town. Now, Herod the king, there are many Herods in the Bible, and we're going to talk about them as we come along to the scriptures that mention Herod. But this particular Herod is known as King Herod the Great. And King Herod the Great was called King Herod the Great because he was a great administrator, and he did large building projects in his domain. He wasn't a Jew, although he was called the King of the Jews. He called himself the King of the Jews. He was appointed as King of the Jews by the Romans, but he wasn't a Jew. He was an Edomian. He was descended from Esau, and the Jews really hated him. He was a really cruel king. I wrote down some of the cruel things that he did. He was extremely paranoid that somebody was going to take his throne from him. And because of his paranoia, he killed his own wife, along with 3 of his own children, along with his mother-in-law, brother-in-law, and uncle. So he was a real murderer. If you want to look it up, I won't mention it because it's pretty gruesome, but he missed the wife that he killed, and so he did something with her body that you can, if you want to know, Google, but it's pretty wicked. Emperor Caesar Augustus said that it was safer to be Herod's pig than to be his son, because the Jews, of course, didn't eat pigs, and although he wasn't a Jew, he would have been trying to live like a Jew to a certain degree, at least publicly. And so he wouldn't have killed his pig, but he had no problems killing his own sons. So it was safer to be Herod's pig than to be his son. And when he died, which is later on, he knew that nobody was going to mourn him. And so what he did is he had a bunch of prominent people in the city rounded up and gave orders to have them executed upon his death so that people would be mourning when he died. That's how much of a wicked man this was. He was an extremely wicked and evil man. Now, the wise men are really interesting. Sometimes they're called kings, and I think in my first sermon I referred to them as kings. They weren't kings, they were wise men. And the words translated wise men come from one Greek word, which is the word magos, which is sometimes translated in some translations as magi. Now, Magi is really interesting. There's an interesting history to the Magi. They're in the Old Testament. They're mentioned in the Old Testament, and they're mentioned specifically in the book of Daniel. Now, Magi were basically very learned men who would study the natural sciences. For example, they studied mathematics, they studied astronomy, they would have studied ancient texts, from all different religious groups and so forth, as well as their own religion, the Chaldean religion, things like that. They would have read some of the scriptures of the Jews as well, because the Jews lived in Babylon. The wise men come from the east, so they're coming from what we would call today Persia, Babylon area, that sort of thing. Persia, Iran, Iraq, they come from those areas. But they didn't just study the natural sciences. They also studied things like astrology, as well as divination and things like that. Now, these particular Magi, I don't think were into that stuff. They would have studied it, but I don't think they would have practiced it, and we'll talk about why in a moment. But if you go to the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 5, you see the Magi mentioned there. And Daniel, when he and his friends were in captivity in Babylon, as many people know, because of their wisdom, were placed in charge of all of the wise men and astrologers and basically rulers of Babylon. And if you go to Daniel chapter 5, verse 11, and here this is I don't know if many of you are familiar with the story in the book of Daniel, when the Persians took the kingdom from the Babylonians. They took Babylon from the Babylonians, and Belshazzar was having a feast as the Persians were outside, and they were, toasting to the gods. And you had the finger that came with the writing on the wall. Some people remember that story. And nobody could interpret or understand the meaning of the writing that the finger had written on the wall, and it was the finger of God. And so the king's mother came and spoke to the king, and she said this in verse 11 of chapter 5, "There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the Spirit of the Holy God. And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers." Now, the word translated magicians here is the word Magi. It's the word magos. It's used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. It's translated as magos, which is the Magi. And so we can see that the Magi are basically found in the Old Testament, and they were people that would have been pagans. Most of them would have been pagans. They would have worshipped, they could have been Zoroastrians, or they could have worshipped the false gods of Babylon. They were into, the natural sciences, as I said, like mathematics, astronomy, philosophy maybe, reading ancient texts, as well as things like astrology and divination and that sort of thing. And Daniel, when he was there and all of the Jews were exiled to Babylon, Daniel would have had a great influence upon these particular people. And so it may be the case that there were some godly Magi who were perhaps trained in astronomy and astrology. And remember, in those days, they didn't really separate those things. They kind of, put them together. Today we separate astrology from astronomy, but back then they wouldn't have. So they would have been trained in all of these things, but I don't think they would have practiced astrology. They would have practiced astronomy. John MacArthur in his Bible commentary says, "They were not kings, but magi, magicians or astrologers, possibly Zoroastrian wise men from Persia, whose knowledge of the Hebrew scriptures could be traced back to the time of Daniel." The Unger Bible Dictionary says the term magi was used as the name for priests and wise men among the Medes and the Persians and Babylonians. So these, and there was a hereditary priesthood in what was called at the time the Parthian Empire. The Parthian Empire was an empire that kind of rivaled against Rome, and the kings of the Parthian empires were appointed by the Magi. And so it says here in this text, if we go back to the book of Matthew, it says, Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east, Magi from the east, came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. So they had come to worship the king, and they had seen this particular star in the east. Now, there is a prophecy in the Old Testament in Numbers chapter 24, where it talks about a star. And this is a prophet who was not a Jew, a prophet that was asked to come and prophesy against the Jews when they were coming up from the wilderness to take the land of Canaan. But instead of prophesying against them, this prophet by the name of Balaam actually prophesied in favor. He prophesied a blessing upon them because that's what God commanded him to prophesy. And it says this, Numbers chapter 24, verse 17, and this is a prophecy about the Messiah. It says, I see him but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob. A scepter shall rise out of Israel, and batter the brow of Moab, and destroy all the sons of tumult. So here we have a prophecy about a star coming out of Jacob and a scepter coming out of Israel. And so many people believe that this was a prophecy because it was a prophecy of a pagan prophet, you could say, a non-Jewish prophet, a Gentile prophet, probably a better word to use. Because this was a prophecy of a Gentile prophet, it may have been that the Magi had this in their collections. We know that they didn't have the book of Micah because when they were asked where is the Messiah to be born, they had to consult the religious leaders of Israel to get the answer. So they didn't have the book of Micah. It's unlikely they had that, but they would have had this prophecy, and they would have had the books of Daniel as well. And it's really interesting because when you read Daniel chapter 9, Daniel gives a time period for when the Messiah would come. He gives it 483 years, and we're not going to do a study on Daniel chapter 9 today, but he gives a prophecy of 483 years from the time of the commandment from the king of Persia to go and rebuild Jerusalem. From that time of that commandment through to the coming of Messiah will be 483 years. And it talks about it, uses the term 70 weeks, and the weeks represent 7 sets of 7 years. And there's a period where he comes and then a period where he dies. It mentions in there that he's cut off and he dies, and then the Jerusalem temple is destroyed. So it's a good study if you ever want to get into Daniel chapter 9. But Daniel chapter 9 gives this prophecy time period, and so these Magi most probably would have been waiting and expecting the Messiah to come. Now, when it says that there was a star, I think we need to be careful because some people seem to think that this star was kind of like a natural star in the sky, and they were studying the stars like astrologers, and as they looked at the alignment of the stars, they saw that a king was born. And this is called astrology. When people do that kind of thing and they look at the stars and they look at the natural phenomena of the sky and they start to look at the alignment of things based on, when you're born, you've got, your different star signs and that sort of thing. That sort of thing is astrology. It's not astronomy, it's astrology. And astrology is expressly forbidden in the Word of God. But the star that the Magi saw would have been something supernatural, something that wasn't normally there. It wasn't like an alignment of natural stars. It was a supernatural sign directly sent from God. It was something that, was not normally observed, a supernatural star that God revealed to them. And because of that, and because of the timing, they believed that that was a fulfillment of the prophecy in the book of Numbers, and they began to head towards Jerusalem to come and worship the king. Now, if we go to Matthew chapter 2, verse 3, it says, "When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him." Now, there might have been a couple of reasons why he was troubled. Number one, he is concerned because these Magi, who normally appoint the king in the Parthian Empire, had come to seek the king of the Jews. They believed that the king of the Jews had been born, and he himself believed that he was the king of the Jews, and so he felt threatened by these Magi who would have been coming to appoint a king over the Jews. And so he was troubled. And all of Jerusalem was troubled with him, and there could have been a couple of reasons for that. One reason could be that they knew that Herod's tendency was to be violent and to try to kill anybody who was a rival, and if he doesn't know exactly who this child is, he might kill all the babies in Jerusalem, which we see later on is what happened in Bethlehem. Another reason why they may have been concerned is because, as I mentioned before, the Parthians and the Romans would fight against each other from time to time. And they fought over the region of Judea. In fact, 40 years later, the Parthians invaded Judea and appointed their own king. But eventually, King Herod, with the help of the Romans, took it back from them, and he was appointed king of Judea. So the arrival of these Magi could have troubled Jerusalem because it could have made them start to believe that war was about to break out between the Parthians and the Romans. Going back to Matthew chapter 2, verses 4 and 6. "And when he had gathered all the chief priests and the scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. So they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea. For thus it is written by the prophet, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people. Now, it seems as though, as I said, that these Magi were coming because they believed a king had been born and they were coming to worship this king. But these religious leaders, even though they knew about the coming of the Messiah, they knew where he was going to be born, they weren't really interested in seeking him. They weren't really interested in seeking him. And this is very similar to what Jesus said to the scribes and Pharisees. And you're going to start to see this conflict between Jesus and the religious leaders of Israel. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 42, Jesus said, and he was speaking to the religious leaders, he said, "The queen of the south will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed a greater than Solomon is here." See, these Magi had come, from a long way away. They'd come to see the Messiah. They'd seen his star. They'd been waiting for him. They'd been searching for him. But these religious leaders who were right there knew where the Messiah would be born. They had the same prophecies. They knew the Messiah would have to be born 483 years from the command to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. In fact, when you read ancient historians like Tacitus and Suetonius, these are non-Christian ancient Roman historians, they actually mention that the entire East, including Judea, were waiting with anticipation for a king to be born from among the Jews. This is what actually, you see this in the Roman historians and writings, that they mention this, and then they say that they were mistaken. Those writings and prophecies were relating to Caesar Augustus or the Roman emperor. So they kind of tried to say, oh no, they were wrong. It was actually our emperor. But those writings show us that at the time, the people in the east and the people in Judea were expecting a king to come, and they expected this king to rule the world. This isn't in Christian writings, this is in secular, ancient Roman historian writings. And of course we know there was much frenzy at the time of Jesus and John the Baptist that the Messiah was going to come. But yet these religious leaders were just not interested in seeking out the Messiah. But these Gentiles were. And this really begins to show us a theme in the New Testament. As you read through the New Testament, what you find is the Jews rejecting Jesus, especially the religious leaders, and the Gentiles accepting him. And this is really to fulfill prophecy. When you read a lot of the Old Testament prophecies, you'll see that when the Messiah comes, according to those prophecies, he will be rejected by his own people. So, for example, you've got Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53 is really interesting because it reads like a confession. We esteemed him stricken and smitten by God, which is what the Jews today believe. They believe that Jesus was judged by God on the cross. So we esteemed him to be stricken and smitten by God, but he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. And so Isaiah 53 is really like a confession, perhaps a prophetic confession of a future generation of Jews who will one day return to the one true God and turn to Jesus and confess that they were wrong all along. And so we can see that this is the beginning of that, the Jews rejecting their own Messiah. Then Herod, verse 7, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star appeared. You see, he wanted to know what time the star actually appeared, because the wise men actually arrived after Jesus was born. The wise men didn't actually arrive at the time he was born. I know when we have the nativity scene and that sort of thing, we have the wise men there with the baby Jesus in the manger and stuff like that. But that's not actually how it happened. When you read the book of Luke, you'll see that there is some things that happened in between. They went to Jerusalem, they made an offering, for purity and so forth. There was a number of things that happened. And what we have in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 2 is after all of that. So this could have been several months later, perhaps even a year or two later, that the wise men actually come. And so Herod wanted to know, when did they see the star? Because he wanted to ascertain the rough age of this child so that he could make sure that he killed all the babies, as we'll see in a moment, from that age down. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, because he had found out where the Messiah was to be born, he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the young child, and when you have found him, bring back word to me that I may come and worship him also." Now this is really interesting because, Herod here obviously did not want to worship the one true king. He didn't want to worship the Messiah. He wanted to kill the Messiah. But he was coming across to these Magi as if he was some kind of godly man that actually cared about the Messiah and wanted to worship the Messiah. And this is something that we see in the world today all the time, both in politics as well as in the church. You see people that want to put on a facade that they want to come and worship Jesus. I love Jesus just like you. I want to worship the King just like you. But really, inwardly, they are extremely evil and wicked people. And they seek to deceive godly people who want to worship the one true King. So don't believe everybody that says that they're a Christian. Don't believe everyone that says they're a pastor. Don't believe everyone that says that they want to worship Jesus, because if we were to believe everyone, we would have to believe King Herod, and King Herod was a wicked man who murdered many people. So we can't just accept everyone, otherwise we would have to accept these kinds of people as well. So just because somebody says that they love Jesus, it doesn't mean that they really do. Verse 9 of Matthew chapter 2, when they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them. Some people say that this star could possibly be an angel, and I think that's possible as well. Till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Then, being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed for their own country another way. I think that as well shows that these men were godly men that God spoke to in dreams. That's why I don't think that they would have been astrologers, they would have been astronomers. But I want you to notice here that when they saw the king, when they saw the star, the star that was going to lead them to Jesus, they rejoiced with exceeding joy. Now, when you compare that to the religious leaders who were just indifferent towards Christ, they weren't interested in Christ, they didn't want to worship Christ. Then you have Herod who wanted to kill Christ. And then you've got the Magi, the wise men, who were filled with joy and came and worshipped him. And I think that's a really good picture of many people in this world. You see many people in the world that they don't really care about Jesus. They couldn't care less. It's great that you want to worship Jesus. You can go and see him, but they're not really interested. Then you have people that absolutely hate Jesus Christ. You can sit at the dinner table with some family members and you can talk about pretty much anything. You can talk about Buddha, you can talk about Muhammad, you can talk about, even Ouija boards and supernatural things. But the moment you start to talk about Jesus, all of a sudden everybody's uncomfortable, everybody's upset. They don't want to know about Jesus. They hate Jesus. And many people, you think about the people on the left, extreme radical people on the left, absolutely hate Jesus. And if they could, they would try to kill him just like Herod did as well. But unfortunately, he's in heaven and they can't. So that's a good thing. But then you've got other people that just really don't care. They've got nothing against him at this point in time, but they're not really interested in him either. Now, I want you to notice as well that these wise men, when they came to Jesus, and this is something I think every Catholic should consider, is that they didn't bow down to Mary. The wise men didn't bow to Mary. They didn't bow to Joseph. They bowed to Jesus. And I think this is important. We as Christians, we don't bow down before statues of saints or Mary or anything like that. We bow to Jesus. We don't bow to any statue either because Jesus is in heaven. We prostrate ourselves before God, before the Lord who is in heaven. Now these gifts are worth looking at. These three gifts. Some people think that because there were three gifts, there were three wise men, but there were actually, there's no mention in the scriptures of how many wise men there actually were, but we do know that there were three gifts. The first gift is gold. And gold in the scriptures is used to symbolize royalty. as well as deity. It's used to crown kings. You make a golden crown to crown a king. You use gold to, the golden scepter. You have gold on the throne of a king. You've got gold also used in temples. Idols are overlaid with gold. You have, Nebuchadnezzar's statue, which was of solid gold, right? So gold is used, and also gold is used obviously in the temple. The Ark of the Covenant is overlaid with gold. Different parts of the temple utensils and so forth are overlaid with gold. So gold could be symbolic of royalty and divinity. Frankincense, it was also used in making anointing oil. It was used to mix with other spices and so forth to make the anointing oil for the service of the tabernacle. It was used also to anoint priests as well. And myrrh was used to make perfume, especially the kind of perfume that was used to prepare bodies for burial. When you read John chapter 19, verse 38 and 40, you see that Jesus, in fact, why don't we just turn there? John chapter 19. I think that was my phone that rang, so I just or dinged. John chapter 19, verse 38 and 40. Just one page. It says, after this, and this is when Jesus died on the cross, after this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus. And Pilate gave him permission. So he came and took the body of Jesus. And Nicodemus, who at first came to Jesus by night, also came bringing a mixture of myrrh and alloys, about 100 pounds. Then they took the body of Jesus and bound it in strips of linen with the spices, as the custom of the Jews is to bury. So you can see that myrrh is used for burial. And so when you look at these three gifts, it may be that they're symbolic of Jesus' kingship and divinity, and his service as a priest. He's obviously our high priest who intercedes for us. And it also could be symbolic of his death, that he died for us on the cross. Now going back to the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew chapter 2, verse 13. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph. So the wise men had departed at this point. An angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise, take the young child and his mother, flee to Egypt and stay there until I bring you word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. And when he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, Out of Egypt I call my son. Now this is a really interesting prophecy here, because this particular prophecy, when you look at it, it's found in Hosea chapter 11 verse 1. It doesn't really say anything about the Messiah. It doesn't really seem to be about the Messiah. In the context of the passage, the prophet is recounting how God brought Israel out of Egypt. That seems to be what it's about. It doesn't really mention anything about Jesus as the Messiah. So why does Matthew use it here in this particular passage of Scripture to say that it was fulfilled, out of Egypt I call my son? And the reason why is because Jews in the first century use a particular type of interpretation called midrash. Now we might refer to it as typology. And so there were certain things in the Old Testament that kind of foreshadowed things to come. And so the calling out of Egypt for Matthew, as he speaks under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, is a foreshadowing of Christ coming out of Egypt as well. So, and when you go through the book of Matthew, there's a number of comparisons between Jesus and Israel. Let me give you some examples. We've heard, first of all, that Jesus came out of Egypt and Israel came out of Egypt. Israel passed through the waters of the Red Sea, and Jesus passed through the waters of baptism. Israel was tested 40 years in the wilderness, and Jesus was tested 40 days in the wilderness, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. Israel received God's law on Mount Sinai, and Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount. So it's a very similar situation, right? Israel was fed with manna from heaven, and Jesus fed the crowds with bread in the wilderness. Israel was called a light to the nations. Jesus brought light to the world. Israel entered the promised land under Joshua. Jesus, whose name in the Greek is the Greek form of Joshua, opens the way to the true promised rest through faith alone. Again and again, as you go through the New Testament, you see that there's this comparison between Jesus and Israel. There's also a comparison between Jesus and Moses. Jesus is the new Moses as well. So that's why Matthew says that this is a fulfillment, because it's kind of like a foreshadowing of the coming of the Messiah. And you're going to see this in the New Testament. It's like sometimes it's referred to as like a double fulfillment. You'll see a prophecy in the Old Testament that's fulfilled immediately, but then there's a second fulfillment. And this is something that Jews in the first century did, and even Jewish rabbis today do as well. They see double fulfillment, but they don't like to apply the double fulfillment in the Christian particular prophecies that refer to Christ. So going back to Matthew chapter 2, verse 16 to 18, then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry, and he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem, in all of its districts, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men. So it seems as though the wise men probably started heading out from the east to Jerusalem or to Judea about 2 years before they actually arrived. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah, saying, a voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation, weeping, and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted because they are no more. Now this story really shows that Herod, it's kind of showing a comparison between Pharaoh in Egypt and King Herod, and also Moses and Jesus. There's a comparison being made here in this story because Pharaoh tried to kill all of the children of the Israelites, and Moses escaped. And in the same way here, King Herod tries to kill all of the Jewish babies in Bethlehem, and Jesus escapes. Matthew chapter 2, verse 19 to 23. Now when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, arise, take the young child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the young child's life are dead. So Herod had died. He was about 70 years old, actually, at the time that Jesus was born, and he was actually already quite sick, which is really interesting because you have to ask yourself the question, why would he really feel threatened by this baby? I mean, he's 70, he's pretty sick already, he's probably close to dying, and he probably knows it. I think what it is that Satan is stirring up his heart. Satan is the one that ultimately wants to kill Jesus, and so Satan is the one that is actually stirring up his heart with hatred and causing him to want to kill the Messiah. Now, Herod's kingdom was divided up in 3 ways and was given to 3 of his sons. Archelaus ruled Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. Herod Philip II ruled the regions of the north of Galilee, and Herod Antipas ruled Galilee and Perea. So you can see that there's the kingdom of Herod is divided up to 3 of his sons, and it says that Joseph didn't want to go to Jerusalem, didn't want to go back to Bethlehem because Archelaus was reigning in Judea. And Archelaus, when you look at history, was just as wicked as his father, and he was a murderer as well. He was very ruthless, and apparently he was very poor at his job, and eventually the Romans got rid of him pretty quickly as well. So he goes to Nazareth instead. And it says here, and being warned by God in a dream, he turned aside into the region of Galilee and came to and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. Now, there is no prophecy actually in the Old Testament that says that Jesus or the Messiah would be called a Nazarene. And it's interesting, a lot of scholars point out that here Matthew is saying prophets in the plural. And they believe that what he's doing is he's not referring to any particular direct text from a particular prophet. They believe that he's just referring to something that the prophets in general referred to, and that is he would be despised. You see, to be called a Nazarene was kind of like a byword to be called, somebody who, was, not the best kind of person to be around. It was, it says in the Gospel of John, I think it was Nathaniel, when he was told that the Messiah they'd found the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth. He said, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" Right? So it was a bit of a byword for the undesirable sort. And so it could be that Matthew is referring here when he says he shall be called a Nazarene. Matthew is basically just making a general statement that he will be despised. There won't be anything, that is attractive about him in the eyes of fleshly, carnal men. And so that could be, and we know of that with, he was despised and rejected of men, and there's other prophecies like that in the Old Testament. The Believer's Bible Commentary says, Nazarene is used to describe anyone who lived in Nazareth, a town viewed with contempt by the rest of the people. Nathaniel expresses this by the proverbial question, can anything good come out of Nazareth? John chapter 1 verse 46. The scorn heaped upon this unimportant town fell upon its inhabitants as well. So when verse 23 says he shall be called a Nazarene, it means that Jesus would be treated with contempt. Although we cannot find any prophecy that Jesus would be called a Nazarene, we can find one that says he would be despised and rejected by men. Isaiah 53